Good morning. I am Barbara Brown, Clinical Director of Red Bird Therapy. We are a psychotherapy center located in Toronto, but we serve people across Ontario and all of Canada. I am so happy this morning to be here with Stacey Sanderson at the beginning of her book launch and tour with this amazingly beautiful book, Heart Wide Open, and that's what today is going to be about. Today is a brief webinar, and then we'll have a short Q&A time where folks can bring their questions. And I have watched Stacey's work as a psychotherapist from a distance, and I've done some of her, I've certainly read the book and I've done some of her work, and I have great admiration for her wisdom. She is coming with years experience, clinical experience, and personal experience. And today is just going to be an amazing time to learn from you, Stacey. So welcome. Glad to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much, Barbara. I got a little bit teary just hearing that you'd marked up the book. Like, that's what I want to hear. I want to hear that people have their highlighters and their pens and their
It's
markers.
true. I have
Yes.
comments all the way through.
Wonderful. So it is my pleasure to be here. And it's so interesting that as we started talking, I'm in my home office and we have a family of cardinals living here, and I can see them as we're talking. So the red birds here on my end have joined us. So as Barbara mentioned, am a psychotherapist as well as a social worker. I'm also a coach working out of the Peterborough area and seeing some folks all over Ontario. And I have some American folks as well as some from Nova Scotia and the West Coast. But it is such a thrill, and it is a little bit scary talking about Heart Wide Open, which is the narrative that goes along with the transformational healing program I have, or recovery program. So when I was writing the curriculum for Transforming Pain to Power, it really came out as a book. And so I just started writing. And what this is the culmination of, oh gosh, more than 20 years of sitting with clients and then doing the research around narcissism. And what originally inspired this was me seeing a number of women in my in the practice I had in a primary care clinic who were presenting with a variety of what we now know are autoimmune illnesses. What we now know are things like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, MS, um, the different types of arthritis, type 2 diabetes, that whole list of things, as well as anxiety and depression. And what happened was I started taking a history with them, an attachment history, a trauma history, a relational history, and some patterns started to emerge. All right. Some patterns with respect to um, family histories and their role within the family of perhaps not having their needs met early on, and then patterns of dependence and codependence, and difficulties with boundaries, difficulties with saying no. So that was the earlier 20-year basis for the work. And when I did my master's degree, I focused on the biopsychosocial roots of illness as well as personality pathology. So this means, being very anchored in how certain types of stress, particularly relational stress, influence the body, as well as taking a look at the roots of personality pathology, right? It's kind of like looking at the two sides of those relationships. And then fast forward to the pandemic, where, of course, all psychotherapy pivoted online. I was actually teaching during the pandemic, which was not a picnic. But what happened was I discovered that I loved creating curriculum and online delivery. And as many as my dear colleagues had done, just really integrated that into my work. The other piece of this is, and anyone who works with me knows this, I have a real visceral response right now to all of this scorched earth, wounded victim archetype stuff that is out there about narcissism, right? There is a lot out there. My coach would call this junk food, information that is very negative, very low vibrational, very narcissistic in its own way, I would say. And the book is a response to some of that stuff, but it's also my pure and utter frustration that we have come to a place where we are using information from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the DSM, to label and characterize our loved ones. What is that? Right? What is that? I mean, I was trained, as many of you were, to use that, in a multi-axial, or using that as an assessment for someone, and I didn't do that, right? So there's just been this worrisome trend over the last, I don't know, 10 years or so. So the book is a response to that as well. And lastly, in addition to having a richer, more informed, more empowered understanding of narcissism, it is also my mission to help those who are natural empaths, who are gifted, who are hiding, who are in the spiritual closet, if you will, because the world needs you. And that's probably now 75% of people working with me around that, I would describe in that capacity. So, these are therapists, healers, body workers, energy workers, holistic healthcare providers. That's a big chunk of who I've ended up seeing, mainly because I think I put that out there, right? That those are the folks I want to help. So our focus today, before I hand it over to answering some questions, is about narcissistic wounding and then the 5 pillars of narcissistic recovery. Now, that subject and that topic is something that I first blogged about in 2013. So I've been talking about it and been a bit more public about that since that time frame. But to distill it all down, what I see when people are in narcissistic relationships is a distinct loss of self, a loss of sovereignty or personal power, and a lot of confusion. So a big part of what I do is to help people break through some of that confusion and make things a little bit clearer, and get them reoriented to focusing on themselves rather than the narcissist. So that's a big part of it, not to mention the energetic drain that influences the central nervous system. So we now know that it is, in fact, the vagus nerve system that is what's influenced by someone else's negative energy. So if we think of narcissists particularly, or we can weave in, other different types of character pathology or toxic people, these are people who are dysregulated all the time, right? They are just like bears with a sore bum all the time. Even if they're not showing it, there's a great difficulty with finding an even keel emotionally, and they lack self-awareness. So then you become, or anyone becomes, an easy target for why they might be feeling that way. So those are 2 parts of That, and then another aspect of narcissistic wounding is intermittent reinforcement, where you are rewarded for doing what they want and where you might be punished or there might be a withdrawal of love if you are not. So I'm just going to set that context up. There are two separate things. One of them is how people become aware of their narcissistic abuse and the steps they take or what they experience, right? And then the other piece is the specific steps toward recovery. These overlap, but they're often separate. So, because I am recording the book right now, which is one of the most difficult things I've ever done, and I should have written a book about pie because saying narcissism over and over again isn't easy. But it's fresh in my mind, what I'm referring to here. So I'm going to just share with you. I'm not going to do this ad nauseum, but I'm just going to share with you a little bit about what I've written here about the phases of recovery. So I've said the second phase is getting information, which I refer to as people doing their doctoral dissertation in narcissism. This is, of course, easier with the advent of the World Wide Web and instant access to information. There is an ease of information, but this usually creates more confusion, as it likely should. The DSM was never designed for us to identify personality disorders in our loved ones. Information is a bit like fast food, while knowledge is more like a nourishing meal. True knowledge is power, and discernment is how you use that power. There are people who get very stuck in this phase, and I've had the same conversation with clients over and over again as they're trying to pin down if their partner is narcissistic. Often these folks keep asking this question in a variety of different ways. Much of the dilemma is about weeding through the information, as much as I try to have people trust their own instincts and what they are observing. They are rendered hopeless and powerless by self-doubt when nothing really confirms what they want to hear. Yeah, I am on page 2021. Yeah. The secret really is that the answer lies with you. All right. I did really well there without my glasses. Just skipping ahead, I'm now on page 22. Many of the clients I see come to therapy feeling broken, sad, frustrated, and believing that there is something wrong with them, which, of course, in part is because they've been told they are flawed, that they are broken, or that they are the ones with the mental health issue, which is rarely the case. They have been on the receiving end of what we are currently referring to as gaslighting, where your inner reality is repeatedly questioned and anything you say or do may be used against you in the relationship. I remember a Facebook quote several years ago that prompted you to ask yourself before you diagnose yourself with depression if in fact you're not surrounded by assholes. This is, of course, rather hilarious, but not inaccurate. I am familiar with many anxiety and depression screenings and assessments, and none of them mention the qualities or reciprocity of our relationships, even though these are profoundly impactful on our state of mind and emotional health. This is why more current therapy modalities, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, I'm just adding that in, may have limitations, and why more psychodynamic, somatic, and relational approaches to healing from narcissistic abuse are the better way to go. For example, and now I'm just paraphrasing, often what we can feel as anxiety is really your own natural intuitive sense sending a signal that something is wrong. And thus, the healing and recovery from these types of relationships and experiences happens on multiple levels: cognitive or mental, spiritual, emotional, physical. And so the pillars of this recovery, I'm a pretty visual person sometimes. So if you picture, the recovery at the top, and then this is what anchors it, is awareness, but primarily self-awareness, right? Having this, um, this inkling, right? And sometimes it's a subtle, tap on your shoulder, and sometimes it's a brick falling on your head. Sometimes people come into the therapy space because there's a crisis, there's an abrupt something happens in the relationship, like an affair, or there's a tipping point, or someone gets really sick. But often a crisis precipitates that initial visit into the space. Um, or someone's, doing that doctoral dissertation and researching narcissism. But the way I like to redirect it is back to the individual. If that's you, then that's who I'm referring to, themselves. Um, and then that's the first part, is then we build on to that by looking at old patterns of attachment, relationship, and conditioning. So in the book, that's referred to as your attachment blueprint, as well as understanding your authentic or your early conditioning. If you are super curious about that, there's an online course on my website that focuses primarily on that you can do at your own pace. It's like dipping your toe in the water. And I've ran that workshop many, many times. From there, we go on to understand patterns of energy and power, right? So I think we're at 3 now. And then, of course, the next one, which is number 4, is about boundaries, right? So I don't know, I was going through a spiritual thing when I wrote the book. And so in the book, and in Transforming Pain to Power, it's called a blessed boundary. I may change that. This book came with a lot of profound intuitive hits and spiritual downloads. And even when I read it now, I'm like, wow, I said that. you know, not it's kind of funny. But the boundaries are all about responding from your own value base and doing what feels aligned with you versus reacting to the other person, right? So it's the difference between having a boundary that is rooted in compassion and self-compassion, really key, rooted in mindfulness, and then what I call FU boundaries, right? And I still resort to FU boundaries all the time. Like, it just happened, right? I had a little backslide with the narcissist in my life. Just giving you a little bit of personal stuff. Very recently, because I was tired, I let my guard down and I backslid and went into an argument. And now I'm just working on pulling back, getting regrounded. So the boundaries are about time, money, resources. They're physical, they're energetic, they're spiritual, and most importantly, they're about not taking responsibility for anyone else's feelings. All right? Most importantly, it's about not getting pulled into patterns of guilt based on that old intermittent reinforcement or newer. Lastly, the 5th pillar is about living in that authentic, joyful consciousness. So, right around Christmas time, I did a whole bunch of podcasts about how to set boundaries at Christmas or the holiday season. Um, because it was American, it was a mix of, all of the holidays around that time of year. But It is living into a state of joy and contentment, right? When I was younger, I would like without even like because I've been doing this since well before we had all of the bombardment of information we currently have about narcissism. But I would just say, to myself that being happy and living a good life was the best revenge, right? So half of that is right. But the idea here is that when you're around someone who is miserable and easily triggered all the time, your number one priority is to not go into that with them. And if you're an empath, that can be really hard to do. So it's important to stay in a heightened state of joy and contentment. Now, I'm a trauma informed therapist and I am trained in EMDR. I have worked with people with structural dissociation, which is also known as, multiple personality disorder. I've done parts work in interfamily systems work. So I've been in the trenches with people. So when I heard this idea of staying in a high vibration from the coach I work with, I dismissed it. I was like, no, that can't be it. That's too easy. But it isn't. And all of the things I've just talked about, all of those more traditional therapeutic modalities can very much include this, what is called this joy acclimation. So that's a term coined by my coach, Shelley Ryuta. And she's right. And she's right that the best thing we can do is take radically good care of ourselves, be self compassionate, and enter into a state of, at a minimum, peace and equanimity. So all of that information you can find on my website or on YouTube or in the book. But, that's the foundation of the project. That's a snapshot into the work. And I would love to stop talking now and open this up to some questions.
Okay, that was awesome. Thank you
Thank you.
so much for this foundational piece, just in terms of understanding the wounding, but really shifting the conversation to what can we do and where can we go and how do we take care of ourselves in a really conscious, intentional recovery process, right? Is
Yes,
your work so focuses on a kind of empowerment, a spiritual empowerment, an energetic, a psychological empowerment that says we don't have to kind of be caught in that position of being wounded, being harmed. We have so much more agency available to us when we have that awareness, that self-awareness, and the awareness of other. And for me, that is an amazing shift in I think really, Stacey, you're at the cusp of trying to change that. Like, we have so much discussion out in the digital space about narcissism and how awful it is and how powerfully wounding it is, which, it really is. But this piece that you are bringing to dialogue is actually quite new because it takes us outside of how am I hurt to what is the life I build and how do I do that, regardless of where that person is who's not that great for me, where they are in my life. And to me, that's actually like an incredible invitation to spiritual and psychological freedom. So
absolutely.
I
And
always want to give you honor for that kind of pushing us down the road of getting better and stronger.
that's the message, that's the message that caught the attention of a publisher. Um, and I didn't know what I was doing. I was just, sounding off as I tend to do. But it is 100% from being, the compassionate witness of hundreds of people for over 20 years, right? And I began my career in healthcare. versus mental health care, right? So, I was a medical social worker before I became a psychotherapist. I know we're not allowed to like designate what kind of social workers we are, but oh well. Um, it's but that really is what the inspiration is, and it's also for me, integrating my own natural intuitive gifts and abilities, and working from that place, because I now work in a holistic clinic, and that's been really exciting, is to integrate, a little bit of the tarot and a little bit of my own intuitive work with permission, and everyone knows when it's coming, but that's been pretty exciting as well. But I maybe I'm naive, but I think that we can make big shifts and changes if we're focusing more on the power of, people who are gifted and who are empaths versus, giving all of this attention and focus to the more toxic people, right? Like literally, I have people come into my office and they'll spend the entire hour talking about the other person. That's amazing to me, right?
Yeah.
Again,
Yeah.
it's all about
It,
them,
it speaks to how much space psychologically that other person actually gets inhabits. That's part of the win, I feel like, of the narcissist. And it's like, oh, how do we shift that? How do we invite ourselves to do this differently? Um,
Yes.
Look, we've got some questions coming up in the chat, and really
Yes, I
we're
just caught that.
here for Q&A. It's so exciting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to formally thank you just here, and I am going to turn the recording off so that people have a great deal of freedom this morning to bring personal questions as they need. So, Stacey,
Wonderful.
here we
Thank
go.
you. Okay.